You know, you guys are going to get really excited when you hear me read this, and I'm going to totally let you down. But concerning that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day the Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at his proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces, and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So last week we covered the meaning of outer darkness, being thrown into outer darkness, and weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so we're not going to go over that again this week too much. But 2 weeks ago, we left off with the first sentence of Matthew 24, where Yeshua, or you might call him Jesus, leaves the temple, hearkening back to the dramatic exit of the presence of God from the temple in Ezekiel. This week we're skipping over all the pronouncements about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans because they've already happened historically for us, so we're not going to talk about it. And we'll be focusing on one of the most primary commandments of Scripture, the command to be ready. Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome to Character in Context, where we explore the historical context of Scripture and talk about how it bears on our own behavior and our witness as image bearers. You can find my teachings on my websites, theancientbridge.com and contextforkids.com, as well as my YouTube channels, which are accessible from my websites. You can also access past broadcasts on my podcast channel, characterincontext.podbean.com, which also links to my iTunes channel, and my context books for adults and families are available through Amazon.com. Now, this is a very popular section of Scripture for people who are interested in the rapture, which I am not, so you might be disappointed. But I figure there are already about 1 million teachings on that anyway, if you are interested in it. Frankly, I don't even remotely see that as the point of what Yeshua was saying here. And to delve into the heart of his warnings, we have to investigate the 4 parables that follow. The parable of the faithful servant, which we'll talk about this week, the parable of the 10 virgins next week, and then the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. They each emphatically tell us what we are to be doing in order to be ready, what we can and cannot expect, how not to be distracted, and what God will, and by extension, will not be expecting from us. Now, at the beginning of Matthew 24, the disciples are marveling at the temple buildings from the incomparable vantage point of the western slope of the Mount of Olives. And yet Yeshua informs them that it'll all be gone in a generation. In response to this, they ask him two questions. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Two questions, two answers. One, when will the destruction of the temple complex in Jerusalem happen? And two, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, the answer to the first question is quite specific, giving them the circumstances and signs about when the temple will be destroyed. And, truly, what he says does line up very well with the siege of Vespasian and Titus that occurred between 66 and 70 of the Common Era. But for the second question, they will be sorely disappointed. Yeshua gives them no answer. And in fact, he tells them he doesn't even know when it's going to happen. Instead, he instructs them to be ready, to be awake at all times. But what does being ready entail? Well, the answer is found in each of the four parables in Matthew 24 and 25. Now, let me tell you what the parables don't say. They don't say anything about knowing the shape of the earth or being up to date on the latest theories on who the Antichrist is this year. Being 50, I've lived through the presidencies of 6 different Antichrists, and that I can clearly remember them actually being labeled as such. And I have it on good authority. The speculation goes back further than that. It doesn't tell us to make sure we know who the 10 horns are or any of that. That boils down to what people who have a lot of time on their hands have the luxury to focus on. Not people who were trying to survive from year to year like his audience was. But what are we called to do? Well, we also aren't called to, it's not a requirement to have any sort of academic life. You won't see that being heralded as being awake in any of these parables. Being ready also isn't equated with prepping, which wouldn't have even been possible for Yeshua's audience of subsistence-level farmers and slaves and artisans who were living hand to mouth, and indeed for the majority of his followers throughout the last 2,000 years. Now, right off, he tells them plainly, the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. That right there should drown out any hope of date setting or any dream of thinking that, that we can know when to expect it. For the last 2,000 years, every single generation has searched the scriptures and has found proof in them that the return is imminent, and every single generation has been wrong. Statistically, that means that we are probably wrong too, and we need to always be of the mind to settle down for the long haul, to endure, to prepare to be here doing his work until we die of old age, because to plan for anything else, for some release from serving God here and now or in the future probably is not going to happen. Let me tell you the mistake that I made while homeschooling my kids who just graduated from high school. And, I didn't mean to do it, but I made a mistake common to a lot of well-meaning parents. Because, I talk to parents about this, and a lot of us have the same story to tell. In the religious education of my kids during the first year of homeschooling, I gave them the impression that they would never be adults because Yeshua was returning any time now. Now, the result wasn't lighting them on fire to serve God, or to do their schoolwork or to prepare for their future. No. They figured they would never graduate, marry, have kids, get a job, or any of that. It was hard to educate them when they had such a hopeless mindset. They were young and wanted to live and get married and have kids and have careers, and I crushed that out of them. It wasn't my intention, but the road to hell could be paved with my intentions alone, all right? I was excited about Yeshua returning, but I taught it all wrong. I wasn't doing my job as a parent by preparing them to live as adults in the world. I taught them to keep the commandments as children with no hope of ever having an adult life. I was robbing them of any sort of true life in Messiah, teaching them to live, to serve God and others. Fortunately, I undid the damage, and my son Matthew is going to Missouri State, and he's getting his degree in criminology. So because he wants to be an FBI agent or a detective, all right? Andrew wants to get a nursing degree now. Andrew has a girlfriend, and his fondest dream in life is to get married and have a ton of kids, which hopefully will not happen anytime soon. But definitely someday. But it wasn't easy to unindoctrinate them. It's like swearing in front of your kids for the first 10 years of their life and then stopping and wondering why they don't follow suit. And when they look at you weird when you tell them, we don't use that kind of language in this house, young man. It's like, well, we did for a long time. I don't know what happened to you. Now, before we begin, I want to point something out. Being ready has to be something available to every single believer in every culture throughout time. Let me repeat that. Being ready has to be something available to every single believer in every culture throughout time. Therefore, it cannot be dependent upon wealth, intelligence, beauty, athletic ability, free time, spiritual gifts, or technology. Yeshua wouldn't tell people to be ready if it required internet access or literacy or whatever, because historically that has been out of reach for most believers, and he wasn't catering to our generation, nor was he catering to wealthy Americans, which, even the poorest of us are pretty darn wealthy. Now, before we talk about this first parable, I want to go over the quote-unquote rules of the parable that I covered in depth in episode 8, the parable of the four soils, which is available in the archives of my Podbean channel, characterandcontext.podbean.com. 1. A parable is a story concerned with teaching a moral, usually one that's spelled out. Think Aesop's fables, and you guys, and I'm not saying you guys don't know parables. Of course you know parables. But everyone, even unbelievers, know of Aesop's fables. You've got the story of the lion and the mouse. The lion has a little thorn in his paw, and the mouse removes it, and then the lion protects the mouse later. And there's a lesson in that. And then there's the story of the fox swimming across the river with the scorpion on his back. The scorpion wants to get across. And Scorpion stings him, of course, and then there's the dog who's on the bridge looking down on the water. He has a steak in his mouth, and he's looking, and he can see in his reflection. He thinks it's another dog with a bigger steak, so he drops his steak to get the other dog's steak. Parables, fables, okay? Moral teachings. 2. Parables describe a vague reality or pseudo-reality without oftentimes being at all realistic. King parables are notorious for having nothing to do with the reality of living as a king in the ancient world. But, Yeshua's audience has no idea what they live like as kings. So, and neither did the audiences of the rabbinic parables. You tell a story that appeals to people, and it doesn't matter if it's realistic. 3. The moral often has zero to do with the parable itself, a fact which is ignored by the audience, who are expected to be entertained by the story, which in turn makes them willing to accept the moral, even if it has nothing to do with this story. But I'll tell you something, Yeshua's parables are actually set the gold standard for actually having something to do with the story. Some of the ones that you get, like in the Talmud and the different writings, it's kind of like, I'm sorry, why did you just tell that story? It has nothing to do with the point you're trying to make. Number 4. The same parable can be used, and often are used, by two different teachers to say completely different things. 5. Parables cannot be used to develop doctrines, because they're generally not realistically describing situations, but instead teaching through larger metaphors, and sometimes very questionable metaphors by modern standards. 6. Parables rely on hyperbole, which is a fancy word meaning exaggeration for those of you who do not remember your high school English, which I do because I had to teach it, which was yucky. Often saying that something, hyperbole. It says something that isn't true, but is actually recognized by the audience as being untrue, but it's done in order to make a point. Let's talk about some modern hyperbole. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, that's bogus. Sometimes what doesn't kill you just makes you weaker. You know, you're not stronger in a coma than when you're not in a coma. All right? How about this one? The gold standard of lies. The customer is always right. But we know what it means. It's not actually correct. The customer isn't always right. And very often they're not right. But there's little to be won by arguing with a customer, because you usually just lose you a customer, and in the long run that can go very badly. Another one that Yeshua did. You know that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. Well, it wasn't, and they knew it. See, this sounds gross, but orchid tubers were eaten in that part of the world as a delicacy. Okay, and that seed is much smaller, but it was an idiom. You know, it was something. It was an expression. No, it wasn't the smallest seed, but he was making a point. So nobody cared that it wasn't the smallest seed. He wasn't lying. He was giving a cultural expression. So the deal is, when we read parables, we have to suspend a certain amount of reality in order to take away a lesson from it. If we're too literal or too nitpicky or try to line absolutely everything up, the whole lesson will fall apart, even with Yeshua's parables in general. Anyway, okay. The parable of the faithful servant, the first of our 4 parables. Who then, and I'm reading from the ESV, the English Standard Version, who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And last week we talked about that. He will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. That's rejection language. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is how people felt at the concept of being separated from their people, their clan, their land, their everything. There was nothing worse in the ancient world than rejection. And here he's talking about being rejected actually from the household. It's from the people of God. So let's get some of our Greek words clear here, and hopefully I will pronounce them all correctly. I learned them about a week ago, and I did this, and I forgot to review them. So faithful is our translation of the word pistos, although I personally prefer trustworthy, and I will tell you why. According to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, known as the TDNT, which takes up an entire row on one of my bookshelves, pistos was a term associated with the military. I talked about this in more detail in Context for Kids, Volume 4, Image-Bearing Idolatry in the New Creation, but we're going to touch on the meaning here. Pistos is the trust required in military operations. Each level of soldier, from the general on down to private, has to have this type of trust in their immediate commanders. Well, generals obviously don't. Well, I guess he has to answer to the king. So yeah, we could do that. Who in turn have to trust them in this way as well. If this sort of trustworthiness or reliability wasn't present, then an army couldn't accomplish much of anything. Everything would descend into chaos with the battle plan falling to pieces. So the general has to know that if he gives an order, his colonels will carry it out. And the colonels have to know the majors will obey them. The majors have to blah, 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 blah. But it has to go all the way down to the privates, okay? So the privates have to trust their corporal to give them the right directions. The corporal has to have trust in his sergeant. Trustworthiness, pistos, from top to bottom, going both ways. Everything in the ancient world is reciprocal. That's how they thought. Now, servant is the word doulos, and in the context of the Roman Empire almost certainly means slave. Now, slaves were different, very different in ancient Rome than we think of as far as European, American, or modern Islamic slavery, especially modern Islamic slavery. Slaves were often well-educated and trusted members of the household, responsible for great things, and could even be government administrators, and often they earned wages. They were also generally set free by the age of 30, or at the age of 30, sorry, although they still remained bound to the household as clients, and they would remain loyal to their death. Household is oikoteia. Oh, I did it right. And it doesn't describe a modern household of father, mother, kids. It refers to a very extended network that goes beyond family members and includes slaves, retainers, and clients. We talked about slaves when we talked about who were the Pharisees and scribes. I haven't talked about patron-client relations yet, though. One of these days I will. I don't know if you've ever read this passage this way before, but besides Yeshua, what biblical hero does this bring to mind? Okay. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Well, you might think of Eliezer of Damascus, but really this is a picture of Joseph. This right here is a life story of Joseph, not just twice over, but 3 times over. The slave of Potiphar, who was placed over his entire household because he was faithful and wise. Once he was put in jail, he became the steward for the head of the prison because he proved again so faithful. And also, he was the servant of Pharaoh. Everyone was Pharaoh's servant, even the higher-ups. And he cared for the entire people of Egypt. He was constantly giving food in season, okay, and caring for everything. Now, how awesome and awe-inspiring that Joseph is the very first example among the parables of the good and faithful servant. Reading into it, of course. He's not mentioned. As the story of Joseph would have been well known inside and out to all Jews, this was an excellent place to start with God's expectations of living in readiness. Now, Joseph was always faithful with whatever he was trusted with. He withstood sexual temptation of the worst sort. He didn't spend his time in bitterness or trying to escape. In the prison, we don't see him starting riots or spewing curses against Potiphar or trying to take vengeance against his wife or slandering her, but he proves trustworthy and able. As Pharaoh's right-hand man, still a slave, just Pharaoh's slave now, he gets to work saving that heathen nation that enslaved him. Joseph doesn't spend his time in bitterness and unforgiveness, taking vengeance and getting revenge. He's always serving the best interest of his master, which we're going to see is a common theme in these 4 parables that we're going to be talking about. We're almost on a half hour here, but yeah, Joseph. Joseph's just a wonderful picture of everything. We can learn so much from Joseph. Gosh, I don't know about you, but if I was Joseph, I wouldn't have taken it so well. I would have been a Debbie Downer. I'm just saying that's the truth. I don't know how cheerful I would have been, and I think I probably would have been grumbling under my breath a lot of the time. But that's why there is a section of the Bible written about Joseph, and there is never going to be anything written in the Bible about me or you. So we're all. Yeah, Joseph's great. Talk to you in a bit. Hi, this is Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome back to Character in Context. This week we are we're beginning our series on the 4 readiness parables of Matthew 24 and 25, and we're starting out with the parable of the good and faithful servant. And so we've already covered the beginning of it, so let's jump back in. But if that wicked servant says to himself, "My master is delayed," and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version this week. And we've been talking about, we talked about in the first half how the good and faithful servant the ideal is Joseph. Absolutely the ideal. Now, he could have slept with Potiphar's wife and no one would have been wiser. That's the equivalent of the wicked servant who beats his fellow servants and drinks with drunkards, okay? He could have absconded with prison funds. He could have hoarded the enormous wealth of Egypt for himself instead of profiting Pharaoh. At each step, we will see this in each parable, actually. Joseph served his master faithfully, no matter who that master was, doing whatever that particular master needed. Now you might say, hey, but Joseph was prepping. Yeah, but that's an example of carrying a parable too far, because although Joseph would naturally be thought of in the parable of the good and faithful servant, Yeshua's description was of someone who was faithfully serving and providing for the entire household, not someone who was just providing for themselves and their own household. I'm not saying you can't prep. Don't go there, okay? Don't get mad at me. I'm just saying that we see nothing about that in any of these 4 parables about being awake and ready for the return of Messiah being equivalent to prepping. I mentioned Joseph, Yeshua didn't, so you can't say that because Joseph was doing something, I'm just using him as an example. And that's actually a problem that we moderns get into with parables, is we want to read too much into them on one hand, and we want every little detail to match up, but that's not how parables worked. So remember, I mentioned Joseph, Yeshua didn't. That's just my way of showing what a faithful servant looked like. Now, we have had a wise and faithful servant described, and we've had a wicked servant described. Both of them were caught unawares by the return of their master. No warning was given, but one was living a lifestyle of doing the will of his master constantly, and the other was living wickedly. One was caring for and providing for others, while the other was abusing and oppressing his fellow servants and only caring for himself. Now that phrase, fellow servants, is key. The wicked servant is still just a servant, but he's behaving like a tyrant, like he is the master and not a very good master at that. He's gorging himself and drinking at somebody else's expense. Why did the master set the servant over the house? Let's look at chapter 24, verse 45 again. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over the household to give them their food at the proper time? He knew about giving himself his food at improper times, but he was set over the household for one reason and one reason only, which is to feed his fellow servants at the proper time. He was put there in order to be their servant. His leadership was about meeting their needs. I tell you, I see a lot of folks out there really concerned with having their own needs met. And I'm not innocent, okay? But Yeshua is directing us to meet needs according to the level of responsibility he's placed us in. There's no reason on earth for anyone who is not in a coma or incredibly ill not to be serving someone else in some capacity, large or small. Each servant in the house is there to serve and not to be served. But we are really a demanding bunch. Demanding our food in season while refusing to care for others. What happens when we abuse our brothers and sisters in social media and in the congregations out there in the world and then the people of the world, and we gorge ourselves with internet teachings all day? Here's you're listening to me on the internet. We're wicked servants. If we're abusing people while we're doing that, we're wicked servants. It feels righteous. That wicked servant in the parable probably wasn't doing what he was doing because he felt unjustified. He was in charge. And that was what power looked like to him and how he felt he ought to wield it. He wasn't actually doing his job. He was just taking, and the only thing he was giving out was abuse. It was the faithful and wise servant who kept representing his master's interests and making sure that everyone else was cared for. So let's go back to this. Who then is the good or the wise? Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant, whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I'll tell you a mistake people make right off is they read parables like this and they say, oh, that only applies to pastors and teachers and evangelists and prophets and apostles or, elders. No, that applies to all of us. Every single servant in the household has somebody else who they have been given to serve, like I said, unless they're in a coma. Even if you're in a hospital bed, and you will be for the rest of your life, doggone it, when the nurses come in, make them happy. Share the love of God with them. Doesn't mean you have to be preaching at them. There's almost nobody who can't do something to bring the light of God and the love of God into the lives of others. All right. So, we're not all in the ministry, but everyone has kingdom work. Everyone. All right. Now the wise and faithful servant will in the future be set over his master's possessions according to this parable, but he isn't there yet. The master hasn't come yet. We're still supposed to be feeding people and giving them, whatever in their due season. Now the wicked servant is presumptuous and is already acting as though he has been set over his master's possessions, and he is misusing them. Big time. And he's cut in pieces. Dang. That is clearly bad. There's just no way to make that pretty. That's like last week we talked about the king who was angry at the guys who didn't come to his banquet, and he killed them and he burned their town. It's like scorched earth policy. Whew. He's put with the hypocrites. Okay? So he's cut in pieces and put with the hypocrites. That's actually kind of funny because it sounds like shoot them, and interrogate them and shoot them. I'm trying to remember what line that movie's from. But but he's put with the hypocrites, a word that means actors. He was a servant acting like a master. He was not acting like the servant he was. He was playing a part in the presence of his master, or his master would never have left him in charge. Let's face it, if Yeshua was here, we would all behave ourselves all the time. I mean, as long as we knew that he was him. And so it's good that he's not here so that we can be tested to find out what kind of servants we really are. Are we those who serve faithfully, or are we those who are grasping, abusive, power-hungry gluttons? Because you can be a glutton about a whole lot more than food. That's just the easiest. That's the one I want a piece of cake right now. Okay. I got to stop thinking about that. We have to be very honest with ourselves about what abusive, oppressive behavior looks like nowadays. Legally, we can't actually physically beat on each other anymore, well, at least in America. And slavery is illegal in the civilized world. It's easy to push this lesson back in times and credit ourselves with not physically beating and abusing other people, and the food and drink we consume are our own purchases, right? Well, here's the deal. In the ancient world of slaves, the greater would beat on the lesser with impunity. That's how it worked, just honor shame. Worked with slaves too. That's what authority gave someone the right to do. A master in the Roman Empire could have a slave crucified for no reason at all. And I talked about that in episode 5, A Slave's Death. Okay? Sure. We can't legally pummel other believers, although abusive spouses and parents ought to read this section of Scripture and tremble in their boots in mortal fear. But verbally, psychologically, and otherwise, we can tear down and destroy fellow servants of God over the slightest offense, or just because we want to. We do it in congregations, through prayer chains, and most especially on the internet. And even those who don't do it themselves, well, let's be honest, they listen and watch, and sometimes with a lot of enjoyment. It's fun to pass around memes of politicians we disagree with, right? It's a blast to pass around stories of dubious authenticity, just because we want to believe they're true. We want to call people idiots for daring to disagree with us on a Bible matter, right? Or we imply that if they had the Holy Spirit for real, they would agree with us because we've got it, and that's what the Holy Spirit told us, and we use that to justify some of the most ludicrous things on earth, things that we later find out are wrong. How many times have you been wrong? I'm wrong a lot. And so I gotta stop, Oh, I'm not all that in a bag of chips. Oh, and we love to demean those who are struggling with sin issues, right? Here's the deal. When we're demeaning people who are struggling with sin issues, we're revealing our own sin issues, because demeaning others, it's exalting ourselves. What do Yeshua say over and over and over again? And we've taught this. Anyone who exalts themselves shall be humbled, but anyone who humbles themselves shall be exalted. We need to take that incredibly seriously. He wasn't kidding. The truth is, we just love beating and abusing our fellow servants, neighbors, strangers. Westerners share a very cruel culture. And very much like ancient people, we again have come to see anyone outside our immediate circle as less than human. We've fallen asleep in the areas of caring, compassion, kindness, self-control, and gentleness. We're not trustworthy with our calling when we beat and abuse people over minor issues publicly, not only publicly, but endlessly and brutally. certainly I'm not the only one who's experienced this. Heck, I'll tell you something. I used to do it myself to people before God smacked me down and hard. But I was being a wicked servant, even if I never laid a finger on my fellow servants, but I sure laid hands on their reputations and dignity, and publicly at that. And I always had a reason why I was justified, and that's the most revolting part of it. It may have been that this parable was a dig at the Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection and lived lives of wealth and oppression over and against their fellow Jews. They really were acting as though their master was never returning, but because they really didn't believe he was. But it's so much larger than that. And, I always say this, and I mean it. We cannot afford to look at any part of the Bible as ancient history. In every single story of every single villain in the Bible, every single story of every single sin, if we look hard enough, we can find parallels to our own lives. And that is why the Bible is such a rich, alive, and vibrant book. It's not because of the prophecies. I mean, yeah, that's really cool. That is cool. But it's because it is a book that is alive, that teaches us about ourselves if we allow it. And, as we go through these 4 readiness parables, we're going to see it time and time again. Yeshua's going to be hitting it from different angles, but it's all going to be showing us how to live lives that are ready. And it's all about constantly just living faithful lives. And you might go, well, how do I do that all the time? Well, it's like, just live faithfully. Don't abuse other people. Don't exalt yourself. Lift others up. Whatever capacity you find yourself in, do that. Yeah, there are so many things that we can do to serve our fellow servants. And it doesn't have to be having a radio show and teaching. How many people do we really need doing that? One teacher can reach a whole lot of people, and so I would say we are very much less important. Other teacher going, what? No, I'm serious. I would say teachers are in a lot of ways, we're more responsible for what we put out there because we can lead a lot of people astray. But in a lot of ways, we're less important than, we are less important than moms and dads, and especially people like foster moms and foster dads. Oh my gosh, they're just like my heroes. And, that's a way to serve your fellows. That's a way to get people served. You can serve down at the VA hospital, just volunteering. Goodness sakes, go to retirement homes. Listen to people's stories. Help them out. Find a way to serve. I don't recommend Vacation Bible School because that is just literally hell on earth. You can tell I did a lot of summers of Vacation Bible School. But you get the idea. You have a lot of power in your life. And I don't care how extroverted or introverted you are, you can find things to do for people if you look. Every community has ways to serve, and it doesn't have to be under the banner of a church. We just serve people. Yeshua said to his disciples in John, they will know your mind because of the love that you have for one another. But, beyond that, because he was talking to to Jews who were taking it in the context of, they could have taken it in the context of, and they did for about 10 years, well, okay, so we keep it in the community, we will do good towards our fellow Jews. And for about 10 years, the gospel didn't even go beyond the Jews in the land and in the diaspora. And Yeshua had to actually give Peter a vision that no, they were to go out and serve the Gentiles too, it was crazy talk. It was crazy talk. I mean, we can't eat with those people. They're unclean. They're idol worshipers. They're defiled. We're gonna get defiled. No. But if Peter and Paul and Barnabas and Mark, if they could go out and serve the people who in their minds were the enemies, oh man, what can we do in our neighborhoods? Right? We tend to put up artificial barriers around who we can and cannot serve. And oh man, that is just so dehumanizing. Yes, we need to serve our brothers and sisters. But if you look at it, even if people don't realize it, we're all servants in this world. We're all nothing but slaves. And maybe believers can equate themselves to the slaves who have been given the responsibility to feed the others. I mean, maybe this is bigger. Maybe this is bigger than just what we do to our fellow believers. It has to be bigger than what we do to our fellow believers because our witness in the world is incredibly important. And I say it all the time. Nobody wants to hear me teach if they're starving to death. Why would they? No one wants to hear the gospel if they're starving to death or if they don't have a place to sleep. What is it? There was a place in the scripture where Yeshua rebuked people who would say, if you see your brother in need and you say, hey, be well, be fed, be clothed, and you don't do anything, oh man, you're worse than a hypocrite. It's like when we hear people have needs and we just say, I'm praying for you. But we don't want to help them because we're planning our next vacation. God's given us control of resources. He has. He's put his household in our possession in a lot of ways. Financially, spiritually, psychologically. There are so many resources he's given us that he expects us to expend on others. So whatever you're good at, whatever it is you do, whatever it is you enjoy, oh my gosh, find a way to give it to your fellow servants in due season. And especially the ones that can't give you anything back in return. Because, as he also said, what reward is there in inviting people to dinner who they're just going to invite you back? You're just doing it as far as the whole social thing. You give them, they give you give them again, they give you again. Kind of more just like a party train. No. You are so important in the body of Messiah. You are so important. You can do something for somebody that nobody else can do. Either because nobody else can do it like you do, or no one knows the person who has the need and you know the need. Then God's given you this opportunity. He's placed you over this person in his household to give them what they need when they need it. Oh, well, all I can say is may he find us all doing what we need to be doing when he returns. Hey, let's be ready. Take it easy.